you're here, you're probably a bit of a history buff, maybe even a World War II buff. And if you are, you've likely heard of Simo Häyhä, aka the White Death, or perhaps even Amo Koivunen and his 400-kilometer long meth-fueled ski escape. But one name you might not have heard of is Lauri Törni, the soldier of 3 armies. We hadn't heard of him either until WWII brought his name to our attention, and thanks for that. Now, we just can't believe we hadn't heard of him before. Because how does a Finnish army hero find himself joining an elite Nazi military unit only to survive the bounty placed on his head by the Soviets and end up fighting under a new name for the Americans in Vietnam? This might sound rhetorical, but it's not. The answer is quite simple: his undying hatred for communism. Lauri Törni was born on the 28th of May 1919 in Viipuri, Finland, within what's known as the Karelian Isthmus. Finland itself had only just become independent a couple of years ago, prior to 1917, as the Russian Empire disintegrated due to the creatively named Russian Revolution. It had taken advantage to declare said independence during the chaos, but this didn't come easy. In the immediate years to follow, a bloody civil war ensued to secure this claim, and the anti-communist side managed to come out on top. I'm sure you can see where this is going. Lauri's father, Jalmari, though a sea captain, had lived through this war, seeing his home endure its throes while providing what support he could to the eventual winners, which instilled in him a deep disgust for communism. His time in the, and please forgive my pronunciation, Suojelijyhdyskunta, aka the paramilitary civil guard, only cemented these feelings, as his time working the border gave him a front row seat to the newly formed USSR's antics. So, by the time Lauri was born, these sentiments were healthily built up and ready to be passed down to him, not just by his father, but by his homeland as a whole. He took after his father in more than just his hatred for the Reds, though. He was an adventurous young lad, and further still, an impressively athletic one. He excelled at swimming, skiing and boxing as he grew, but beyond it all, he wanted to be a soldier. His hometown, being in the troubled area that it was, would feature a continuous military presence, and he became obsessed with the armed men that would roam the streets, following them around and even collecting their spent cartridges. His father even came to describe him as war crazy, and he couldn't have been more right. Lauri, as it turned out, was a bit shit at school. Not because he wasn't bright, but he just didn't care. Time spent staring at the chalkboard was, in his mind, time that he could have been spending with the soldiers, and this showed in his academic performance. He was also rather stubborn and hot-headed, according to his teachers, even being held back a year because he refused to sing, costing him 4 years curriculum. You'll see later on that this particular pair of traits carried over well into his adult years. As a teenager, his military obsession had only grown, and he joined the youth organisation of the Civil Guard. Here he learned camping, marching and marksmanship, in which he, unsurprisingly, excelled, finally given a chance to thrive in his element. His parents, though, particularly his mother, continued to fight him on this, and understandably so. Passionate as he may have been, their home's history was blood-soaked, and no mother wants to live knowing she might have to one day send her son off to war. At her behest, he shifted career paths and left the Civil Guards to attend business school. His parents' relief was short-lived though, because despite the initial concession, it simply wasn't going to work. In business school, he felt like that complacent kid once more, sat in mind-numbing classrooms, listening to lectures on things he didn't care about. Worst of all, now he'd had a taste of the life he really wanted, he just had to go back. He thus quit business school soon after, and at 19 volunteered for the Finnish Army, where he was assigned to the 14th Jaeger Infantry Battalion, conveniently near his hometown. This unit was part of Finland's light infantry forces, specialising in rapid mobility and guerrilla tactics. He would be trained to strike hard and fast, prioritising speed while staying lethal and making use of the land he fought on, skills that would become trademarks throughout his military career. He quickly proved to be an outstanding soldier, even in his earliest years, motivated and quick-thinking with a characteristic no-nonsense Finnish approach. This proved timely too, because by this moment in time we're entering 1939, and I'm sure you all know what happens next. At the onset of the Winter War on the 30th of November 1939, Lauri was still serving in the 4th as a junior sergeant out of Kiviniemi, near his birthplace of Karelia. His unit was promptly deployed to confront the Soviet invasion, where Lauri engaged in live combat for the first time during the battles near Lake Ladoga. His battalion proved a nightmare for the Soviets, zipping around on skis and sniping Russians left and right. His battalion played a key role in the destruction of encircled Soviet divisions throughout the area. Lauri, with his lifelong fiery temper still going strong, made quite the name for himself. He not only would often disobey orders and engage the enemy in less than ideal scenarios, only to win regardless, but once he even skied straight over a Soviet landmine only to shrug off his rather serious injuries and jump right back into the battle. So impressive was his performance, in fact, that his superiors chose to overlook his hot-headedness and handpick him for an NCO training program, from which he graduated at the top of his class. Once he returned to the field in early 1940, he was put right back into the action on the front lines, now commanding his own company of soldiers, all of which happened to be from the one area in Finland that, at the time, exclusively spoke Swedish. This didn't stop him though, and despite not speaking a lick of Swedish himself, he excelled in leading his new squadron, finding all he needed in gestures and non-verbal communication, such as pointing to himself, shooting, and then pointing at them to indicate they should do the same. Accounts from both the men themselves and Lauri's superiors tell us that this did indeed do the job. They would massacre Soviet forces wherever they went, sneaking up on them in the snow and bombarding them with hand grenades and Molotov cocktails before picking off any remnants with sniper fire. They were wildly successful, contributing massively to the historic 5-to-1 Finnish to Soviet kill ratio, where Finland claimed the lives of approximately 125,000 Soviets, while the USSR took around 25,000 Finns in return. As comically lopsided as this was, though, it wasn't enough. The Soviets had millions more men to throw into the meat grinder, but for the Finnish, the limit was near. Despite the absolute numbers put up by the Finns, things got quickly untenable for them, and so on the 12th of March 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. Given their losing position, the terms were pretty tough. In summary, the Åland Islands would be demilitarized, the Hanko Peninsula leased for 30 years to give the USSR access to the Gulf of Finland, and much more importantly, 11% of Finnish territory would be ceded to the Soviets. 11%. The equivalent of the United States having to give up both Texas and California. Not to mention the fact that 420,000 Finns, approximately 12% of the population, would now be absorbed into the USSR. Or, well, they would have been if they stayed in that ceded portion. But faced with the choice of either abandoning their homes or, God forbid, becoming Soviets, a whopping 410,000, 97.6% of those Finns, decided to pack up and relocate to areas remaining under Finnish control. Among these territories ceded was Karelia, meaning that Lauri's own family was displaced, wandering as refugees, as his very own home was absorbed into the USSR. If he hadn't already hated communism, he did now. And to top things off, their war might have been over, but the war was only just entering its peak. It was, lest we forget, 1940, and with World War II raging on and the USSR at its limit, Finland was wary of Soviet intentions. They were all too aware of the strategic benefit the USSR stood to gain from them, and couldn't help but suspect that the peace treaty was more like a de facto ceasefire. They also had their gaze aimed south, concerned that the German expansion would work its way up to them as well. The last thing they needed was another enemy of that caliber to wear them down. And so in January 1941, Finnish Army Chief of Staff Erich Heinrichs travelled to Berlin to discuss the situation with the German officials, who reassured him that Finland wasn't within the Third Reich's plans. The USSR, on the other hand, most definitely was, and a German-Soviet conflict in the near future was a certainty. Not only that, but they suggested that the Finns assist in their efforts, rightfully assuming they'd want to seize any opportunity to bring the fight to Russia. At first, Finland was hesitant. Yes, they were bitter over the concessions of the Winter War, but these are the Nazis we're talking about. The enemy of my enemy is my friend and all that, but come on. Their military might just couldn't be overlooked though, and so neither could the opportunity. Despite their initial reluctance, they eventually agreed, although under the explicit clarification that they were not allies, but rather co-belligerents against the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union alone. Finland wanted no part in the rest of the war, had no interest in joining the Axis of Germany, Italy and Japan, and they would simply use the German war machine as a vehicle for their own interests on this specific matter. Anyway, agreements were signed, hands were shaken, and on the 25th of June 1941, the Finns redeclared war on the Soviet Union. The continuation war had begun. Lauri, itching for action, was ready to have at the Soviets. He held similar qualms about the whole thing, as fighting alongside Nazis was not quite what he'd had in mind for himself, but fighting against the Soviets certainly was, and so he compromised. This, as you can imagine, came back to bite him, but we'll get to that later. For now, Lauri's off to Vienna to train with the Waffen-SS alongside 1,400 other Finnish volunteers. For 7 weeks, he learned from the best of the best within the German ranks, expanding upon his current skill set and learning quite a bit about demolition in particular. Upon returning to Finland in July of 1941, now with the fancy new title of Untersturmführer granted by the Germans, he rejoined the 8th Light Infantry of the 1st Division, using his newly honed skills from the Waffen-SS to push the Soviet forces back. He led attacks using captured Soviet tanks, often plunging right into enemy lines and deploying the demolition tactics learned in Vienna to wipe out enemy positions. The offensive eventually brought them somewhere all too familiar though. On the 24th of August, the Finnish 8th Division crossed the WWII Bay, cutting off the coastal route and encircling the city. Just 5 days later, on the 29th, Finnish troops entered WWII, raising the Finnish flag over the city's tower at precisely 17:35. For Lauri, this was more than a military victory. His family could finally return home, a tangible win against the Red Scourge. As the war continued, he was appointed to lead a new unit. This time, his reputation preceded him, and they were eager to aid his efforts. The unit specialized in deep penetration reconnaissance and guerrilla warfare, operating behind enemy lines. They'd become known to so extensively mow Soviets down that they learned to use enemy equipment in order to save ammo while using their own guns against them. Such was the fame earned throughout the achievements in this war that even the highest-ranking Soviet officials took note. More than that, they issued a 3 million mark bounty for his head, equivalent to about $650,000 today, and the largest Soviet bounty of the war by far. This tidbit pushed his reputation over the edge from famous to legendary. His unit informally adopted the name Detachment Thorne with an orange T on their uniforms, proud as can be of their madman of a leader. One of these men, by the way, was future Finnish President Mauno Koivisto. In many ways, he emphasized that we were all the same bunch, and he bore his share just like the others. He didn't ask anyone to do something he did not do himself. He carried his own load, marched at the lead, and was one of us. By 1944, the tide was turning. Germany was unravelling, and Finland knew that holding out alongside them was becoming a losing bet. The Soviets took advantage of the situation. In June, they launched a massive offensive aimed at pushing through Finnish defences for good. Lauri's unit was deployed as a fire brigade, counterattacking wherever the Soviets broke through, patching up the front line with whatever they had left. Eventually, the unrelenting Finnish defence forced the Soviets to reconsider a full invasion. They could wear them down if need be, but World War II had them tapped, so they decided to cut their losses where they could. By September 1944, a new peace treaty was signed. Finland retained its independence, but this came with strings attached, including, amongst other gut-wrenching terms, the loss of Lauri's home yet again, and the formation of a communist political party in Finland. Lauri was, as you can imagine, very upset. He'd been awarded the Mannerheim Cross, Finland's highest military honour, and yet he couldn't bring himself to care. It felt like no matter how hard he fought, he kept finding himself beaten down yet again. He wasn't one to dwell on it though. Quite the opposite. This just meant that he'd have to find a new opportunity to push back against the Reds all the harder. Despite the worsening situation for Germany, the Gestapo initiated a new operation called Sonderkommando Nord, specifically aimed at holding the Eastern Front against the Soviets. Lauri, restless as always and unwilling to simply stand by, volunteered. This now crossed a serious line, since Finland was officially out of the war and thus he was joining the Nazis of his own will. But he was far from caring. All he wanted was revenge, and this was how he was going to get it. And as Soviet forces advanced deeper into German-held territories, Lauri's chance came quick. His training was cut short and he found himself reassigned to the front lines. He joined a German unit near Schwerin, fighting tooth and nail against the Red Army. Lauri fought alongside the Wehrmacht until 1945, as the world around him crumbled, even sustaining yet another, much more serious landmine-relating injury. He continued to command his men from the hospital tent though, best he could, and was back in action as soon as his body allowed. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to be left done shortly after returning to the field. He saw the writing on the wall and, rather than be captured by the Soviets, he surrendered to the British Army and was subsequently sent to a POW camp in Lübeck, Germany. The war in Europe was now at a close, and Lauri was left sitting in a jail cell waiting to be tried for his cooperation with the enemy. But in June 1945, rather than wait around to be sentenced, He simply escaped. I'm afraid we don't have any details on that one, but he did make his way to Finland, and again, we have no clue how he actually managed to pull that one off. He's just extremely resourceful. And so, after a multi-month-long mysterious journey across Europe, he finally arrived to Finland. But his peace wouldn't last long, as in early 1946, the Finnish secret police, the Valpo, the communist leadership of whom was no secret, had their sights set on him. And of course, his wartime associations with the Germans hadn't been forgotten either. So Lauri was arrested and charged with treason, sentenced to 6 years in prison. The accusation was simple. His collaboration with the Nazi regime had put Finland at risk, and in this new political climate, he was an easy target. But the public didn't agree. Some took the story at face value, sure, but many knew damn well that Lauri was no Nazi. He was just a man looking for whatever way he could to kill more Soviets, and they respected that. Despite this outcry though, in January of 1947, he was chucked in prison. But not for long, because by December 1948, less than 2 years into his 6-year sentence, Finland's new president, Juho Paasikivi, began dismantling the political persecutions that targeted veterans like Lauri, leading to his pardon and release. But freedom was bittersweet for Lauri. The Finland he returned to wasn't the home he remembered. He was now an outcast. Pardoned or not, his name had been dragged through the mud, and despite his best efforts, he was an outcast in his own home. This new life wasn't what he wanted. He was now a warrior without a war to fight, in a country that didn't want him. And so Lauri decided he had to leave. His first move was an escape to Sweden in 1949, forcing a taxi driver at gunpoint to help him cross the border with a borrowed passport. Very subtle. Once in Stockholm though, he lived in hiding, and here he actually began to settle in. He even got engaged to a woman called Maria Palm, and with a wedding date in sight, she went off to Finland to collect his uniform so he could wear it on their special day. Now, the sources differ here. We know he wanted to offer Maria a future, and here in Sweden on a borrowed passport, he had nothing to give. We also know that his solution to this was to request a visa for Venezuela, where the two could go together to seek a new life. But this visa arrived while Maria was in Finland gathering Lauri's things. Where sources differ is on why he decided to just leave, instead of waiting for his fiancée. Supposedly, he felt the Soviets on his tail and didn't want to risk capture. Honestly though, to me this seems a bit horseshit, so take that story with a grain of salt. Whatever the reason, however, he did leave without so much as a goodbye for his fiancée as he sailed his way towards South America in true post-war German fashion. But Lauri had no intention of staying put. Once he was in Venezuela, he met one of his old commanders from the Winter War, and just like that, he'd secured himself the favour of a lifetime. A spot on board a ship headed for the United States. There was one problem though. Lauri was a stowaway. Ever ingenious, however, he had a solution. Once they spotted land just off the coast of Alabama, Lauri simply jumped overboard. From Alabama, he made his way up to New York, where he found support within the Finnish American community. They gave him a place to stay and helped him establish some semblance of stability, even starting a job as a carpenter and a cleaner. They even helped him reach out to his fiancée, Maria, but unsurprisingly, she'd moved on and was now engaged to another man. Maybe don't abandon the supposed love of your life without so much as a farewell next time. He didn't have much time to get over the upset though before things got worse. By 1951, the FBI had caught up with him, and his wartime ties to Germany as persistent of a curse as ever. Lauri was very nearly deported if it were not for the intervention of Paavo V. Swikas, a leader in the Finnish American community who introduced Lauri to William Wild Bill Donovan, the former head of the Office of Strategic Services and a prominent attorney. Recognising Lauri's military experience and potential to the US Armed Forces, Donovan took on the case. You see, around this time, a little something called the Lodge-Philbin Act had been passed into law, which granted asylum to foreign nationals facing persecution by communism. Not only that, but it allowed those same asylum seekers to join the military as a path to citizenship. To Lauri, this quite literally couldn't have been better. He would have his charges dropped, be granted residency, and on top of all that, a lucrative new career killing commies. They just couldn't have signed him up quicker. He received his residency in 1953 and once all was in order, adopted the anglicised name Lauri Thorne before enlisting in the US Army in 1954. Now 35 years old, he was far from the typical private, but his unmatched combat experience spoke for itself. He initially underwent basic training, as he was technically just another recruit, but after proving himself alongside younger soldiers, he was quickly set aside for better use. His superiors, after taking a look into his background, decided he'd be an ideal candidate for the newly formed Green Berets, and it wasn't long before he was assigned to Fort Bragg as an instructor. As the Cold War intensified and the US Army prepared for potential guerrilla conflicts across the globe, Lauri's knowledge from years of fighting the Soviets was a godsend. He trained Special Force soldiers in unconventional tactics, focusing on everything from deep reconnaissance to sabotage and counterinsurgency, as well as Soviet-specific countermeasures. Lauri's reputation within the Green Berets grew rapidly, becoming known for his extraordinary skill set and the depth of his experience. He wasn't just an instructor either, he participated actively in training missions, sharing first-hand insights on the type of warfare he knew best. He got comfortable in this new role, but as the years went on, he started to itch for some real action. So imagine the excitement when, in 1963, Lauri was deployed to South Vietnam. The US sought to make use of his guerrilla expertise to fight the Viet Cong along the Cambodian border, which was outside of American jurisdiction, by the way. Naughty, naughty. His first assignment was at a camp called Chao Lang, a hotspot under frequent attack from North Vietnamese forces. Lauri, eager to get to work, immediately rounded some men together to patrol the skies in search of a North Vietnamese flag they could descend upon. Once they found that yellow star shining bright against its red background, belonging to a small military outpost hidden away in the jungle, they wasted no time swarming the area and absolutely annihilating any and all enemy forces. Definitely off to a strong start. This ferocity persisted throughout his time in Vietnam. He not only provided military advice for reconnaissance missions across the Cambodian border, but also fought alongside his men like he always had. He must have liked it too, because after his first tour, he jumped right back in for round 2. In hindsight though, that was probably a bad idea. In October 1965, he joined a mission to locate Viet Cong supply lines in Laos along the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. The mission was dangerous and the equipment they used was outdated. An old King B helicopter, not quite built for the task. They were initially delayed by worsening weather conditions, but eventually went for it when the window of time began to close. The aircraft, unsurprisingly, became disoriented in the thick clouds and eventually disappeared. Despite a massive search effort that included 56 search and rescue missions, no trace of Lauri or the helicopter was ever found. By 1966, Lauri Thorne was officially declared missing in action and presumed dead. People were skeptical though. I mean, this was Lauri fucking Thorne we're talking about. That couldn't be right. He's not going to just die. Many people outright didn't believe it, claiming that he'd been traded to the Soviets in a covert exchange. Others believed he'd survived the crash and started a new life elsewhere, while another story stated he'd been captured by the North Vietnamese. It wasn't until the late 1990s that a crash site was discovered in Laos, believed that of Lauri's helicopter. With human remains found nearby in 2003, after extensive forensic analysis, the remains were officially identified as Lauri's. His body was repatriated to Finland, where he had a ceremonial funeral before he was brought to the United States to be laid to rest with full military honours at the Arlington National Cemetery. His gravestone bears both his Finnish name, Lauri Törni, and his American name, Lauri Thorne. A man by 2 names, fighting under 3 flags, and fueled by nothing more than his hatred for communism.